There's a specific kind of conversation stopper that I think we've all encountered at some point.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean.
Right. Maybe you're at a dinner party or you're scrolling through a comment thread that has just uh, gone completely off the rails.
Hmm.
It happens the moment someone brings up the history of slavery in the United States.
Oh, yeah. The temperature in the room just drops about 10 degrees, and everyone suddenly finds their shoes really, really interesting.
Exactly. And almost on cue, without fail, someone will chime in with a variation of the same argument. They'll say, well, look, slavery has existed in every culture since the dawn of time. The Romans did it, the Greeks did it, the Egyptians did it. It's just human nature.
Right. It's the universal argument.
Yeah.
And it's this very seductive idea because if bad things happened everywhere, then the specific bad things that happen here aren't really anything special.
It makes it all feel more manageable.
Manageable. Exactly.
And maybe a little distant, like everyone did it, so let's just move on. But today, we are doing a deep dive into a source that argues this way of thinking isn't just lazy, it's a dangerous structural error in how we view our own history.
It is a really compelling piece. We're looking at a blog post that just dropped today,
Right.
February 1st, 2026, on the Knowledge is King platform.
Mm.
It's by an author named Mark Wells, and the title is pretty aggressive, which I love. It's called Stop the Flattening: Why All Forced Labor Was Not the Same.
Stop the flattening. I really like that imagery. It implies we're taking something three-dimensional and complex history and we're just crushing it
Yeah.
until all the details, all the texture just disappears.
That is Wells's core premise.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that when we say slavery existed everywhere, we are, in effect, flattening history.
Yeah.
We're taking all these distinct, complex legal and economic systems that function in completely different ways, and just tossing them all into one big bucket labeled bad stuff from the past.
And by doing that, we miss the specific mechanics of how the American system actually worked. We missed the design choices.
Precisely. Wells argues that U.S. chattel slavery, the specific system developed in the American colonies, was not just another version of what the Romans did.
No.
It was an industrial anomaly. It was a unique machine designed for a unique purpose.
So our mission for this deep dive is to open up that machine. We're not here to take sides or get political. We are here to unpack Wells's argument.
Yeah.
The legal, the social, the economic distinctions.
You want to understand the how and the why.
The how and the why that separates these systems.
Because if you don't understand the blueprints, you really can't understand the building we're all living in today.
Well said. So let's get right into the thick of it. Wells starts by tackling the most common counter-arguments head-on. And I think the big one, the one that always comes up first, is the indentured servitude argument.
Yes. What about the Irish defense?
Right. You hear, my ancestors were indentured servants and they were treated terribly too. And, to be fair, looking at the historical records, it was brutal.
Oh, absolutely.
People died. It wasn't a vacation. But Wells draws a very hard line in the sand here, legally speaking.
He does, and this is where that flattening usually happens. People conflate hard labor with slavery, but Wells says you have to look at the legal status. It all boils down to a distinction between the contract and the condition.
Okay, so let's break that down. What's the legal difference between a servant and a slave in this context?
It's the difference between being a person and being a thing.
Wow.
Wells points out that an indentured servant, whether they were Irish, English, poor European, they remained a legal person under the law.
Okay.
They had entered into a contract. Usually they were trading their labor for a set period, typically 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to the colonies.
So it's a transaction, a harsh one for sure, maybe exploitative, but a transaction between two entities who both still have rights.
Exactly. And because they were still persons in the eyes of the court, they retained those rights. This is a massive distinction that often gets glazed over. An indentured servant could technically sue their master if the contract was violated. They could testify in court, they could own property, they had a legal voice.
Which is something an enslaved person in the chattel system absolutely did not have.
Zero. An enslaved person was property, and property can't sue its owner. But the biggest difference, the one that really just explodes the comparison, is the expiration date.
The 4 to 7 years you mentioned?
Yes. Indentured servitude was temporary. It was the tunnel, but there was a light at the end of it. You knew that if you survived the term, you came out the other side. And Wells highlights a specific mechanism here called freedom dues.
Yeah, I circled that in the notes because it surprised me. Freedom dues. It sounds almost like a modern severance package.
In a way, it was. The system was designed so that when the contract ended, The master was legally required to give the servants something to get started.
So like what?
A plot of land, a set of tools, a new suit of clothes, or a small sum of money.
That completely changes the framing. The system wasn't just extracting labor. It was actually designed to eventually integrate these people into society.
Yes.
It's like the system was saying, okay, you paid your debt, now here's some equity to get you started.
Correct. The goal was to turn them into productive, tax-paying citizens. You work your 7 years, you get your tools, and you join the economy.
Whereas in chattel slavery,
There is no integration. There is no end date. And crucially, and Wells hammers this point, home indentured servitude was not hereditary.
that is the game changer for me. That's where the comparison really falls apart.
Completely. If an indentured woman had a child during her servitude, that child was born free.
Wow.
The debt was the mother's, not the baby's. The condition stopped with the individual.
So even if your life was miserable, even if you died before your contract was up, you aren't passing that misery down your bloodline as a legal mandate.
Exactly. So when people equate the two, they're ignoring the fact that one was a temporary economic period in a person's life, and the other was a multi-generational sentencing of an entire bloodline.
That is a heavy distinction. Okay, so that covers the indentured argument, but then there's the other big comparison. Wells tackles the ancient world.
Right. The Romans had slaves, the Greeks had slaves argument.
And this one's a bit trickier because those were slave systems. They weren't voluntary contracts. But Wells argues we're sort of projecting American dynamics onto ancient history.
He calls this the distinction between misfortune and biology.
Meaning?
In the ancient world, Rome, Greece, even many pre-colonial African societies, enslavement was typically a result of bad luck.
Bad luck.
You were a soldier on the losing side of a war, or your city got captured. Or you fell into massive debt you couldn't pay.
So it's something that happened to you. It wasn't about who you were fundamentally.
Precisely. It wasn't racialized. It wasn't tied to your DNA or the color of your skin. Wells puts it really effectively. It wasn't a permanent stain on one's biology.
And because it wasn't biological, that means the social barriers were different, right? I imagine it was easier to move through the system.
Much different. There was significant social fluidity. Wells gives this fascinating example of Roman slaves. Many of them were highly educated. They were Greek tutors, doctors, architects.
Wait, it's a slave doctor?
Yeah. They ran the master's finances.
That is hard to imagine in the context of the American South. You would not see a plantation owner letting an enslaved person perform surgery on them.
Impossible in the American South. But in Rome, it happened. And because of that, they could win their freedom. They could save money and purchase themselves, a practice called manumission.
Okay.
Sometimes they were freed in the owner's will.
But here's the key question for me. Once they were free, what happened? Could they actually live a normal life?
They became Romans. That's the key.
Yeah.
Because there was no visual badge of slavery, no racial marker a freed slaves could integrate. Their children could become full Roman citizens. 2 generations later, nobody would know or care that the grandfather had been a slave.
That is the flattening right there. We assume slave meant the same thing in 100 AD Rome as it did in 1850 Mississippi, but the stickiness of the status was completely different.
Stickiness is a great word for it. In the U.S., the status was designed to stick forever. In Rome, it was a legal status you could move through.
Okay, so we've debunked the Irish comparison and the Roman comparison, but we have to address the third one. And this is the one that usually gets thrown around as a sort of gotcha in these debates.
The Arab slave trade.
The trans-Saharan trade, yes. This is often used to say, look, Africans were enslaving people too, and the Arab world had a massive trade.
It was, yeah.
And Wells doesn't deny that, right? He's not ignoring the suffering there.
Not at all. He acknowledges it was a massive human rights tragedy that spanned centuries. But again, his mission is to look at the structure, the how.
Right.
And he draws a distinction between assimilation and exclusion.
Assimilation.
Yes. In many parts of the Arab slave trade, the trajectory was often towards absorption. Enslaved people were, over time, often assimilated into the families or the kinship networks of the people they served.
That sounds complicated to modern ears.
It's very complex, and we have to be careful not to romanticize it. It was still forced labor.
Sure.
But Wells points out the roles were different. You had enslaved people serving in domestic roles, but also in military and political roles. He mentions the Mamluks and the Janissaries.
Right, the Janissaries. These were enslaved soldiers, technically.
Technically properties of the Sultan, yes. But they rose to become the elite military caste. In some cases, Mamluks, who were enslaved soldiers, actually overthrew their masters and became the rulers.
They became the sultans.
They became the sultans.
Okay, that is a stark contrast. It is physically impossible to imagine an enslaved field hand in Alabama in 1860 rising up to become the governor of the state or a general in the army.
It was legally and structurally impossible. The American system was built on total exclusion. In the Arab examples Wells cites, the enslaved person could become part of the social and political fabric. In the U.S., Wells argues, the enslaved person was never viewed as a member of society, not even a low-ranking one.
He uses a brutal analogy in the text. He says in the U.S., the enslaved person was viewed like a plow or a mule.
A tool, a piece of capital, with zero path to social integration.
And that brings us to the core of this deep dive. We've looked at what U.S. slavery wasn't. Now we need to look at what it was. Wells calls this the unique machinery of U.S. chattel slavery.
This is the hardest part of the text to read, honestly, but it's the most important.
We throw around this word chattel a lot, chattel slavery,
Right.
but I don't think we always pause to define it. What does it actually mean?
Chattel is a legal term. It literally means movable property. It comes from the same root word as cattle.
So it isn't just a description of a job. It is a definition of existence.
Correct. Wells argues that the U.S. system was an industrial anomaly because it codified human beings as commodities in a way that was uniquely sophisticated. It financialized the human body.
Financialized how?
Think about modern finance. Mortgages, insurance, loans. Wells points out that enslaved people were listed on insurance policies exactly the same way you would insure a barn or a tractor.
So if an enslaved person died, the owner got a check.
Exactly. They were assets that appeared on balance sheets. They were used as collateral. If a plantation owner needed cash to buy more land, he would go to a bank and mortgage his human workforce.
Wow.
The banking system was deeply intertwined with the ownership of people.
That is chilling. It turns a human life into a line item, a depreciating asset.
And to keep that asset secure, the system had to invent a legal mechanism to ensure the supply of labor never ran out. And this is where we get to the law from 1662 that Wells highlights.
The Latin phrase, parta sequitur ventrum.
That which is brought forth follows the womb.
My Latin is rusty, but in plain English.
The child's status follows the mother.
Now, why is that unique? Because in English, common law, which the colonies were based on, status usually followed the father, right?
Correct. In England, if your father was a noble, you were a noble. If your father was a subject, you were a subject. But the colonies flipped this specific rule for enslaved people.
Okay.
By making the status follow the mother, they made slavery hereditary.
And Wells points out the incredibly dark incentive this created.
It is the darkest part of the machinery. Because the child follows the mother, it meant that if an enslaver sexually assaulted an enslaved woman and she became pregnant, that child was not his heir.
That child was his property.
That child was his property. It turned sexual violence into a profit mechanism.
Free prof?
Wells calls it free profit for the estate. It ensured the workforce replenished itself without the owner having to spend money importing new captives. It made the system self-perpetuating.
And this ties directly into the invention of race as we know it.
It does. This is where the flattening completely falls apart. To make this system work, the U.S. created a rigid binary, white versus black. They tied the status of slave to permanent physical traits.
The badge of servitude.
Exactly. In Rome, you could walk away from your past. In America, you wore your past on your face. Even if a person was free, they couldn't just blend in. The system was designed to be inescapable. It wasn't just about extracting labor. It was about creating a permanent underclass defined by biology.
So when we step back and look at the blueprint Wells has laid out, we have a system that is legally unique in its rejection of personhood, it's economically industrial with the insurance and mortgaging, and it's biologically racialized to make it hereditary and permanent.
Which brings us to the big question Wells asks at the end. Why? Why do we try to flatten this? Why is there this cultural urge to say, oh, the Irish had it bad too, or everyone did it?
It feels like a defense mechanism.
Wells argues it's about protecting a myth, the myth of American exceptionalism.
American exceptionalism, usually meaning we are the best, the shining city on a hill, the beacon of freedom.
Right, and if you acknowledge that U.S. chattel slavery was a uniquely cruel, uniquely designed engine of dehumanization that actually powered that city on a hill, well, It complicates the narrative.
It puts a pretty big crack in the foundation.
But it's more than just reputation. It's about responsibility. Wells talks about the long shadow of this system.
Right.
If slavery was just a universal bad thing that happened to everyone, like a plague or a storm, then modern inequality is just bad luck.
It happened a long time ago. Get over it.
Exactly. But if it was a specific engineered system.
Then the results of that system aren't accidents.
Correct. The legacies Wells lists, Jim Crow, redlining, the racial wealth gap, modern systemic inequality, these aren't random glitches. They are the direct downstream results of the machine we just described.
If you build a machine to exclude a specific group of people from building wealth for 250 years, you can't be surprised when that group has less wealth 50 years later.
Precisely. Wells's argument is that flattening history is a way to absolve the nation of the need for repair. If everyone did it, then nobody is specifically responsible. But if the U.S. system was unique, then the U.S. has a unique debt to address.
That is a heavy realization. It shifts the conversation from ancient history to modern obligation.
And that is really the power of this source. It forces you to stop looking for excuses and start looking at the blueprints. You can't fix a machine if you refuse to admit how it was built.
So bringing this back to the listener, we've gone through the contracts of the indentured, the misfortune of the Romans, the assimilation of the Arab trade, and the cold machinery of the American system. What's the takeaway here? Next time someone hears slavery was everywhere, what should they think?
The bottom line, as Wells puts it, is that accuracy matters. You cannot compare a 5-year labor contract to a system that defined humans as furniture for generations.
Right.
When we hear these comparisons at the dinner table, on social media, we have to recognize them for what they are.
They're attempts to simplify the world to avoid uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. They are attempts to close the book on a subject that needs to stay open. Understanding these distinctions, the legal personhood, the lack of heredity in other systems, the racialization in the U.S., it gives you the tools to keep that book open.
It allows you to see the present more clearly because you aren't lying to yourself about the past.
That is it.
You know, there's a thought that struck me while reading the conclusion of Wells' post. He talks about American exceptionalism as the thing people are trying to protect.
Yeah.
But if we stop flattening history, if we admit that the system was uniquely designed to be inescapable, doesn't that force us to redefine what we even consider freedom in the founding of the country?
That is the provocative question, isn't it?
Yeah.
We like to think of freedom and slavery as opposites, but Wells seems to imply they were intertwined.
Right. If the land of the free built the most sophisticated system of unfreedom the world had ever seen, can those two things coexist? Or was the freedom of some directly purchased by the permanent subjugation of others?
It makes you wonder if freedom was a universal ideal in 1776, or just another form of property that only some people were allowed to own.
That is something worth mulling over. Well, that is all the time we have for this deep dive. I hope this gave you some new perspective on a topic that often feels settled, but clearly isn't.
Indeed. It is always worth looking closer.
If you want to read the full argument, and I highly recommend you do, the comment section is probably heating up by now, check out Stop the Flattening by Mark Wells on Knowledge is King. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.
Stay curious.